In this video, we're going to discuss naming conventions for HotDocs variables. As a quick recap, HotDocs variables will replace placeholders in the document. Your document will go from something like this to something like this. This is a HotDocs variable. For this presentation, I'm going to use another program. So I'm going to go ahead and close Word and I'm going to minimize HotDocs. My presentation is in a program named Prezi. And I'm going to expand it here and go ahead and start my presentation for you. Naming components is important because you want to have consistency when you're working with HotDocs. If you create a will, you want to be able to use those same components in the trust for your user's answer file. So if they answer Bob Doe as the testator and then they go into the trust and it's Bob Doe's trust, well, Bob Doe will flow over from your answer file. One of the easiest ways to do that is keep what you're typing in as your variable names consistent. So I'm going to give you some rules and some advice today. First, let's start with the rules. All of the rules I'm going to talk about today are actually in the HotDocs help file. The advice may not be in the help file, so that's something you may want to come back and listen to when you start doing development. One of the very first rules I always talk to people about in live training is do not use all caps in your component names. You can use other case sensitivity, which we'll talk about, but all caps is very important that you don't use. One of the reasons is models. We have a programming language in HotDocs. It's called the models. If you haven't used HotDocs a lot, you'll learn about this in later videos. Our models appear in our program in all capital letters. Some of our models have words in them like the word date, age, NUM for number, and those are things you might try to use in a variable name. I might create a variable name called client birth date. Well, if HotDocs sees the word date in all caps, it tries to perform one of these functions in the model, and that will cause a problem. Now, I always get clients who ask me, what about industry standard industry standard abbreviations? By all means, use those. We're not likely going to take something, let's say PUD. If you work in real estate, you might know that abbreviation for a planned unit development. We're not likely going to put PUD in as one of our models. However, if you're not sure, instead of capitalizing PUD, P-U-D, as your abbreviation as part of your variable name, use something else. It's better to be safe than sorry when you're working in HotDocs that way. Additionally, your components, whether it's a variable or another kind of component in HotDocs, those need to be 50 characters or less. One of the things about that 50 characters or less, a lot of people get nervous. Oh my goodness, how am I going to do this in 50 characters or less? I'll talk to you about some of the advice with that in a moment. You can have numbers in your variable names, but do not start them, any of your components. I'm specifically saying variable names, but any HotDocs components, do not start them with a number. I'm going to give you an example. Client address 1. Client address 2. Those have numbers in them. If I were to type those in, those would have numbers. What I'm not doing is saying 1 client address, as in 1 being a typed numeral. I don't say 1 client address, 2 client address. So use your numbers, just don't put them in the first position in your naming. The following characters, and I'm not going to state them all, you can see them on the screen. The following characters are just not allowed in any component names. One of the things that I give as advice to my clients that I work with is that they don't even use items that are not on this list. One of the most common is an apostrophe. You don't need to say client's name. The user's not going to see your variable name most of the time if you're using a prompt. So rather than saying client's name, and think about it, that's 2 extra characters with the apostrophe and the S, and you only have 50. Say client name. Brief. It's much easier to manage your components if you're brief than if you add a lot of punctuation and other things in your component names. And you're less likely to try to use one of these items in your component names. Okay, let's talk about some advice. Where I mentioned before, one of the rules is don't use all caps. Let's talk about what you can use, and one of the best practices that we use on the HotDocs professional services team. We use this first one, initial caps. So basically what we do is we take a variable name, we break it down, and we break it down by what it is. When I speak with clients, I talk to them about a general to specific naming convention. Generally, it's the defendant. Specifically, it's the defendant name. If I create any other components for a defendant, it will be defendant address or defendant street address, defendant city, defendant state, defendant zip. You're getting the idea. So that might help you stay within that 50 character limit that you have in the HotDocs program. These are some other conventions that I've seen use these other full bullet points. The second to the last one has been used on one of our projects. I wouldn't highly recommend it. I find that when clients pick it up, if we've used it, and then they hand it over and start doing their own work, it is hard for them to remember to put in underscores. It's not a common character that you just type naturally. I find that if you don't want spaces in your naming convention and you want to use something else, then maybe just use the last one with no spaces altogether. One of the problems with using the last one is your word processor looks at that and it puts it in red squiggly because it looks at it as a word that's not spelled correctly. There's pros and cons to all of this. You're going to have to decide what you feel most comfortable with. So again, we strictly use most of the time the top one. That's our best practice. Sometimes I see that people use extensions on the end of their variable names. Now, as best practice, we don't do that. We used to, as a professional services team, we used to even, in fact, train with it as a best practice. We don't do that anymore. Part of the reason we don't do that anymore is HotDocs has more tools in it that make this technique less necessary than it did in prior versions of our program. Does that mean that if you're an existing HotDocs user, go through and rename everything? No, don't do that. That's going to take you a lot of time. Go ahead and leave those naming conventions in as you have them now. If you're an existing client and you haven't had a consistent naming convention, maybe you've had multiple developers and they haven't kept it consistent, call us. Talk to us about ways that you can make your naming convention consistent, because if you don't have a consistent naming convention, you're having a lot of problems with user data sticking, or they're having to re-enter it or other things. So some of these extensions, let me talk about them and their purpose before you decide to use them. One, they go at the end of your variable name. So let's take defendant name. You would type in defendant name, and then it being a text variable, you would put TE at the end. Don't put it at the beginning. The reason you don't put it at the beginning is HotDocs components are sorted by type already in our component file, and it's a lot easier when you're building your screens in HotDocs, which are called dialogues, to have all of your defendant information together, everything that starts with the word defendant together. So it puts things in alphabetical order. That's another thing that's important about understanding a bit about HotDocs. If I have all my TE or text variables together, that's great, but I can sort by type in HotDocs. And when I go to build my screens, I generally build them by defendant information. That's what my user wants to see. So it saves me development time if I put these at the end if I'm going to use them. Why do people use them if we are advising, if in our own practices we're not using them anymore? Well, there are some places within the HotDocs program that you don't see the extensions. When you're building scripts within the HotDocs program, computations, etc., you have the extension. If the extension's not listed there on the end of your variable name, you might not know what type of a variable you're working with. So let's say you're taking defendant first name, defendant middle name, and defendant last name, and you're combining them together in a computation so that you can then reuse that in some way. Or even the address. You're doing an address block, city, state, zip, with address line 1 and 2, and sometimes address line 2 is not used. We see that happen often. So one of the things you might want to do is when you're building those scripts, you want to see the extensions right there, know what you're working with right in front of you. That could be one of the reasons you use this. Note, there is a component box right at the bottom of that screen you would build in where you can see all the components and you can see the icon for the extensions right there. So it just takes a little bit of looking to get what you need. Additionally, why someone might use this is when they're looking at the face of the Word document. There's no indication when I see defendant name, is that a calculation or what we call a computation that strings together the first, middle, and last name, or is that just a text component where the user's typing in the answer? What will help is if you have a very clear, consistent naming convention. Instead of putting in defendant name, you might put in defendant full name. If your set never breaks the name apart, first, middle, and last name, then defendant name should be clear enough to you as a developer without needing the extension. There is some forethought that needs to go into development before you do anything. There is a video we talk about project planning, pre-planning, etc., and I'd watch that video before you start development. So that's where these become useful for you, is where you think you need that extra indication while you're developing. That's the end of this particular video. The next thing you will want to do is actually start creating your components. Thank you for watching this video.